Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and on episode 96, I will be reviewing A Quiet Place Day 1, the prequel to the already established duology of A Quiet Place and A Quiet Place Part 2, starring Lupita Nyong'o and Joseph Quinn. If you're a first-time listener, there will be a non-spoiler review, so if you haven't seen the film yet, there will be no spoilers in there, but there will also be a spoiler review where I run down pretty much the whole plot of the film. That timecode will also be listed in the description. Now, let's get quiet for A Quiet Place Day 1.
You can't have a cat in here.
It's a service cat.
This is likely to be one of the freshest reviews I've ever delivered. Typically, the review is recorded, if not one day, sometimes two after seeing the film. When I'm recording this, in fact, at least the main chunk of this review, I actually have seen the film this evening. So I may have some contemplations that might come to me later, but you're getting the rawest ever review that the show's ever had. So if you're a first-time listener, you should probably know that typically with horror and thrillers, I'm a more of a sensitive viewer and typically don't enjoy them very much unless it's a very well put together film. I am happy to report that this film was not too scary for me, Amber, so I did not have to hide in fear or cover my eyes while watching the film. The setup for this is really interesting. If you are a longtime fan of the Quiet Place films, you do know that they do have some elements of what had happened before, some teases and whatnot. Specifically, A Quiet Place A Quiet Place Part 2 did start off with essentially the origin event of what had happened with the aliens arriving on Earth that are very sensitive to sound and blind. So the framework for what could be a whole movie was a really interesting concept, one that obviously A Quiet Place Day 1 completely leads with. It's a brisk film. It is just over an hour and a half. It's at 100 minutes long, so it goes by quite quickly if you're a fan of films being shorter. There's been a lot of people complaining about films being 2.5 hours long, sometimes 3. And this film is not that. It moves at quite a clip, and the pace of the plot is substantial. What works really well for this movie, well, in general, I'm just talking about Quiet Place Day 1. The casting in this is fantastic. Lupita Nyong'o and Joseph Quinn work phenomenally well together, and given the substantial amount of screen time with the two of them, there does not seem to be any loss of development between those two characters. This is, I believe, the first time directing for Michael Sarnoski, at least independently on his own. And because of that, no, I'm wrong. He did Pig. I quite enjoyed Pig. But the first time that John Krasinki has not directed a Quiet Place film. He was involved with the story for this, but the screenplay and direction were all handled by Michael Sarnoski, which is a big deal. Obviously, there are perspectives on what the ownership was of A Quiet Place to begin with, a script that had been sold, and then John Krasinski significantly rewrote it, and that was the franchise that was birthed out of that. And so the setting for this movie is quite interesting, putting the aliens that we are very familiar with after 2 films in rural America. What does that look like in a populated city like New York? And it is as chaotic, frantic, dangerous, scary, thrilling, as much as you would expect it to be. One of the elements I really enjoyed from this film was its visuals. More often than not, we get to see a really claustrophobic perspective, which is interesting given it being in a big city like New York, but with all the chaos that's happening around, specifically Lupita Nyong'o's Sam, there was a lot of time given to the initial landing of the creatures, and that nature, if you're a fan of something like The Last of Us, the game, or the television adaptation, it reminded me a lot of that. Not in where it felt plagiaristic, but that feeling, the unnervingness of what could happen next was very, very well this is a very poor sentence, but it was systematically integrated into what's going on around the characters. That elevated sense of danger is 1,000% present, and you want that in a film like this. I really appreciate this franchise for its significant time given to the characters. We do get to know them, and I can get into spoilers, particularly why I think Lupita Nyong'o's character is so interesting. But the dynamic she has with Joseph Quinn is quite compelling, given the fact that they are survivors amongst one of the busiest cities in the world. And what does that mean for this place with millions of people, with aliens that are hypersensitive to sound? And we're given a lot of interesting set pieces with those characters, and the journey that they go on, it's quite heartwarming, actually. Even though these characters spend so little time communicating, that's where accolades need to be given. If it's just the reception in general, I don't know if this is necessarily going to get nominated for any Oscars, but these two lead actors have to do so much with next to no dialogue and minimal use of audio from themselves. The volume that to which they can function on is minimal, if not almost nothing. And every form of communication has to be done with their the emotions they are trying to express or trying to communicate, just with their body language and facial expression. And that is a testament to these two leads who are able to do that with absolute flying colors. The terror they feel sheds into the audience. It's ironic. There's going to be a little rant incoming, so if you don't want to listen to it, you might want to skip ahead. If I'm 33 years old, and if you were to average out the amount of movies I've seen since 16, it's probably about one a month. I don't want to do that math that quickly, but I've been a long-time film fan for a very long time. And from the pandemic onward, so let's go back to March of 2020. I know there were closures, but that's not the point. From 2020 onward, talking in a movie in the opening weekend has never been this bad. It's been so frustrating trying to go to see movies. And yes, obviously movies have not been doing well in their theatrical releases as has been expected. Look at June 2023 if you're curious about the lack of box office success to 3 major blockbusters released in that month. But the irony, and I found this incredibly funny, I went to see this film at 4:40 in the afternoon on the Friday release date, and it is the quietest movie I have seen in years. Maybe what the lesson learned here is you need to have your actors not talk or whisper at best, and the audience, at least the city that I see films in, will actually be quiet, which I very much appreciated, because talking in the audience during this would 1,000% have taken me out of this. And fortunately, because it was a quiet cinema screening, I was completely encapsulated by this film. It goes by incredibly quickly, while not, because of its runtime, never wasting any of its screen time, and the developing relationships between the two leads is meaningful, and the journey you go on with them is going to be remembered in the long run. This is in the spoilers, or not in the spoilers, in the trailer, so it's not a spoiler. We do get to see Jaimon Hansu's character for a couple scenes, which is nice to have character continuity to somebody we were introduced with in A Quiet Place Part 2. A Quiet Place Day 1 works as a prequel film to the origin event of this in another place. While, to my knowledge at least, I didn't have a chance to rewatch the two films ahead of time, but having some seeds leading into where we know A Quiet Place Day 2 at least connects to. I'm looking forward to eventually a part 3 to this. I'm thinking it's going to be further down the road, potentially when the lead actress, not Emily Blunt, the actress who plays the daughter, is old enough to maybe potentially be a mother on her own, but who knows what we'll get if we get more from this franchise. With that being said, A Quiet Place Day 1 works as another entry point into this franchise. It doesn't feel like this franchise is bloating or overstaying its welcome. Having it being set in New York is great. It helps make it feel distinct from A Quiet Place and its sequel, A Quiet Place Part 2. So I really enjoyed it. It's a film that Again, if you are looking for something that is in a more original franchise, it will offer that, and it's thrilling. It is funny at times and heartwarming, which I really appreciated that. And I'm really curious to see what Michael Sarnowski does moving forward. If maybe he makes the third film in this franchise, or maybe there's A Quiet Place week 1. I'm not sure. Maybe it'll get the 28 days, 28 weeks, 28 months later treatment. I'm really curious about that. So I would recommend going to see this on the big screen. These films, I've done that twice. These films work really well. I saw Quiet Place not day 1, A Quiet Place Part 2 at the drive-in, which was really interesting. That was COVID times. So I would recommend it. If you've seen the two previous films, you'll enjoy this one. If you've never seen one of the Quiet Place films, this might be the best entry point because it gives you the best idea of the origin of what's going on in this world, and then you might have more fun watching the other two films. I don't know, I'm curious. If you like the film, you can let me know on social media. All the links are in the episode description. So let's jump into spoilers, and I can tell you what happened in A Quiet Place Day 1. Shelter in place. All right, this is full spoilers for A Quiet Place Day 1, where I'm going to break down all the major plot details, so this is your last chance to duck out and jump into the outro. Let's find out. What happened? So the film opens up with Lupita Nyong'o's character, who is Sam. She is living in a hospice outside of New York City and clearly has some flair for humor. She's asked to read a poem, and it makes fun of everybody and has to do with the word bowels. She hates this place. This place sucks. This guy sucks because he craps himself. Things like that. And so she's very quickly seen as a very snarky character, clearly not necessarily handling her situation quite well. Her terminal illness is not explained thoroughly. I think I have an understanding of it, but I'm not necessarily sure. So she clearly is the youngest person here in the hospice, and there is a nurse who is taking care of them, who looked very familiar. I believe, yeah, it is Alex Wolff, who was in, he would be most remembered from the Jumanji films and Hereditary. He's the nurse at the hospice trying to take care of everybody, and decides to get everybody together to go and see a play. Turns out it's a marionette show in New York City, but promises Sam that they're going to go get pizza afterwards. The pizza being a significantly important part to Samira, or that's her full name, and which is revealed as the film goes along. And of course, after leaving the puppet show, she has what seems to be either a panic attack or a painful memory, which causes her to leave the theater. And as they are getting back onto the bus, because something is happening, we see a bunch of army vehicles driving down the road. She gets onto the bus, and the asteroids or meteors encapsulating these aliens start landing, and excrement hits the fan, where we get to see the absolute chaos of one of the loudest cities probably in North America, if not the world. They mention that at the very beginning that New York City runs at 90 decibels pretty much constantly, which is like somebody screaming the whole time, which is awful. And I think ironic because my Apple Watch has a notification for that. And sometimes it happens just when I'm projecting. So I guess Apple's trying to tell me I talk too loud, which kind of explains why my wife has done the same. But that's neither here nor there. And the chaos that ensues is very reminiscent of something like Saving Private Ryan or other war films where somebody gets their bell rung. And because of that, we are... Now, I wouldn't describe it as incoherent because that sounds fair, but in a daze or a haze as things are going around. Because of the cataclysmic damage happening from all of the aliens, there's smoke, which, as I mentioned in non-spoilers, makes, even though we are in this massive city, what the camera is able to see is just Sam and very close distance around her. So she's moving through this smoke. It presents similar to fog, and people are just being pulled out from the smoke, being killed by the aliens. And the madness that is ensuing, people just trying to figure out necessarily what's going on. And eventually, Sam is blasted back into a window. There are surprising amounts of fade outs or cuts to black in this, which I'm curious if that is due to wanting to limit the screen time or the runtime of the film. I'd be really curious to find that out later, but it doesn't feel out of place or kind of out of nowhere, which is nice. And so as she wakes up, we get a group of people where we see Jaimon Hansu's character is sort of, I wouldn't say he's the role model, but the leader of this group, and they've realized that you have to be quiet. It was something I wasn't necessarily expecting, which was that everybody was going to realize that they had to be quiet this quickly. I expected more chaos, but the film did only have, what was it? I believe it was $67 million budget, which would explain why we only get to see so much chaos. Potentially, if it was maybe even 100, we would have seen more casualties of civilians. But the fact that this is almost more of a focused character drama in this massive event we know that's happening across all of North America is one of its benefits, where it does feel more insular and personal in that way, which in my opinion helps set it apart from all the other big blockbusters we are going to be getting this year. It still has the scale of a big film, it being in New York, but the set pieces are slightly smaller, and have set extensions to some areas of New York, but there are a substantial amount of extras in some scenes, and then other times very minimal. And that does help illustrate what likely means a lot of people have died because of the aliens arriving on Earth. And eventually we do meet Joseph Quinn's character, Eric, who really does seem to struggle with the stress of everything that's going on. There's multiple times where he feels like he's about to explode emotionally, and the two of them going back and forth really help sell this film on why it works. You need two leads, and there's no romantic relationship, which is phenomenal. They're just two platonic people who really do wind up caring for each other. And Eric, more so than Sam, really wants her to get pizza. That's mainly one of the crux of the film once we meet them, is that Eric wants to get out of the city, or not. Sam wants Eric to get out of the city, but Eric just wants to stay with Sam because he feels safer with her. And he just keeps following her to eventually she accepts him to go get pizza with her. And we learn throughout the film, it's probably about halfway, I'm not actually sure because of the quick pace of the runtime of this, that Sam's character always used to go to jazz clubs and then go to this one particular pizza place with her dad. And that's one of the things she wants to do because she's terminally ill and she's going to die. It is an element of the film I was expecting to happen more, which is that because she is terminally ill, I half expected her to go through the film being like, well, I'm going to die anyways, and have that laissez-faire perspective, which comes up at the end of the film, but doesn't seem to be following her through most of it, which I'm not going to say is something that doesn't track, but given where Sam ends the film at, I would have hoped it would have been more a through line, because we do get elements, and she does eventually write a letter to Eric, which I will address near the end of the review, but their journey together it's very compelling. Again, as I said in the non-spoilers, they can say very little, so everything has to be expressed with looks to each other. And the bond that they have becomes stronger and stronger throughout the film. There are a couple of great set pieces. There's one where they're in a flooded subway tunnel, another where they're running through buildings of New York, another on a bridge. But the smaller moments for this film are what make it special, particularly one where the two of them wind up in a jazz club, and obviously you can't play music, but Eric winds up doing some magic tricks for Sam, and as she's sleeping, he goes to a different pizza place and labels the box of the pizza place that they wanted to go to, because the one that Sam had wanted to go to was blown up during the cataclysm. And those smaller moments work really well. We get a number of them earlier on in the film. I really enjoyed the scene of them going to Sam's apartment and reading some of her poetry, particularly the poem she had written about dying. And that really gets to Eric. Again, him being somebody who's much more afraid of death, and Sam not really, because of the critical illness she's currently suffering with. We get to see one moment where Eric travels on his own to get the medication she's required. It does say what they are, but I don't necessarily know what that means. I should have asked my wife, but she's on days and I didn't get a chance to get a full medical explanation. She does mention that it feels like everything internally is on fire, which I'm not sure if that would have to do with her muscles, her nerve endings, or the signal she's receiving in her brain, but she does put a patch on her side. So I'm not really certain what that means, but regardless, that's why this movie works. The smaller moments between the two of them sell this relationship, and once they have gotten or eaten the pizza, it's probably scotch, if not rye. I'm not sure. It looked like it was in a decanter, so I'm going to assume it's scotch. But eventually, they get Eric to a boat where she makes a bunch of noise. And as we learned in the 2 previous films, they're afraid of water. Eric gets to one of the boats that's escaping in the harbor. Surprise, surprise, Jaimon Hansu is there. That is my biggest problem with this movie, and I haven't really talked about it. I just mentioned it now, which is this movie has a service cat. You would have heard about it in the clip in between one of the segments. That is Lupita Nyong'o's service cat. It does not make a sound throughout the entire movie. It doesn't really address the fact that maybe it's because it's also terrified of what's going on, which would be totally fair, but it doesn't actually come up at all. It never meows. It never purrs. It doesn't make any noise. That's one of my criticisms. The use of traversal noise is minimal at best, which is fine. They do use the bigger moments, car alarms, smashed windows, glass, and whatnot, to show that they're able to distract the aliens, and they're quite effective with their use of noise. I like the fact that they figured out they could yell while following up with thunder, as there was a storm that happens earlier, and it's such a cathartic moment to see the two characters scream because of the ungodly situation that they have found themselves in. And these moments sell these characters' relationship and help them feel much more relatable. It's cathartic to yell and sometimes let your emotions out that way, as opposed to them all bottling up, which I really, really did like. I've said this in non-spoilers. It's a brisk movie. It moves at a clip. It's really enjoyable. It has a ton of thrilling moments, particularly in the more claustrophobic areas of New York, which I found very unnerving to some degree, trying to figure out how they were going to get out of that situation. So I would recommend it. These two leads are awesome. No wonder they're Marvel stars, but working in these more intimate action dramas is something that I kind of hope we get to see more of, these lower budget films. Well, even though it's been painted over with a recognizable intellectual property or IP, it works well in this avenue, and I hope it's successful. My theater wasn't super full. It was very quiet, which I appreciated, so fingers crossed it's successful. But other than that, I don't really have much else to say about A Quiet Place Day 1. I really enjoyed it. If you did see it and you want to talk spoilers, you can send them later on in the week. Again, all the social medias for the Film Realist podcast are posted in the episode description. Now, let's jump into listener mail. This previous week's question of the week is, what is your favorite series of Doctor Who, specifically in the modern era? So less responses this week, which is not super surprising because I know it was a Doctor Who question, but here we go. Stephanie wrote in, difficult choice, but I'd go with Series 6. Oh, Stephanie. She's got more. Come on, River's identity reveal and all the tidbits leading up to it, phenomenal. But series 5 and 4 are my runners up. Can you tell I love River? I think that's fair. I like series 6 more than I thought. I did rewatch that one in 2023, but no, series 6 is not one of my favorites. I think the back half kind of hurts it. Scotty Cameron wrote in series 4. My favorite series of all of the modern era is series 5. It's the most complete. It's the best from start to finish, in my opinion. And some of that is probably because, I don't know if a lot of people know this, that Stephen Moffat had over a year to write that series, because while David Tennant was doing his specials, that's what Stephen Moffat was working on. So he had so much time to get that screenplay together, show run the whole season, and you can really tell that they were given that time to make it that great. And because of that, it's my favorite season. I love the Pandorica. I love Matt Smith jumping back and forth. It's the origin of the Fezzes Are Cool, which is arguably more iconic than Bow Ties Are Cool. That might be controversial with Whovians, but that's how I feel. This week's question of the week is, what is your favorite John Krasinski role? Because of A Quiet Place being not part of the podcast, I'm curious. You can include Jim from The Office. There's a bunch of other ones, so I'm really curious. What is your favorite John Krasinski role? You can email the podcast, filmrealistpod@gmail.com. You can comment on the social media post, usually goes up Thursday, or you can just say question of the week and at me or at the Film Realist Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Film Realist Podcast. My name is Kyle Naranya. Next week's episode will be a surprise because I don't know what I'm doing. But don't worry, we are still going to be having episodes week to week leading up to episode 100 when I review Deadpool and Wolverine. If you loved the show, please follow it on your podcast platform. Give it a 5-star review if possible. And if you have a film-loving friend who might like the ranting of one individual, share it with them. I really appreciate it. It helps the podcast grow. If you like trailer reacts, you can see those on Instagram, TikTok, and cut up into pieces as shorts on YouTube's Film Realist channel. That'll do it for this week. I hope to see you next time.